Spider Who, Chapter 3. Tony Stark rushed into the apartment building as fast as he could, opting to skip the elevator and instead choosing to take the stairs 2 steps at a time. He still considered himself spry, even if he wasn't in his prime. Besides, he hadn't the patience to wait for an elevator, especially with his knowledge of how slow this particular one was. In truth, Tony was anxious, an emotion that he wasn't all that used to feeling, but still he felt it now. Previously, before his impromptu trek to Queens in the middle of the night, Tony had been in the midst of a virtual meeting with General Thaddeus Ross regarding the whereabouts of Captain America, aka Steve Rogers, and the rest of his merry band. To say that Tony was tired of going around in circles, talking and dissecting endlessly about Cap, was a monumental understatement. It only made it worse when Tony knew that all he needed to do was tell General Ross about that sorry excuse for technology that calls itself a cell phone, the one that Steve had sent him in order to end all these discussions. But he still couldn't bring himself to mention it. So they talked. They discussed, again and again. There had been a brief, happy interruption towards the beginning of the meeting sent from Karen, Peter's AI. Apparently, Peter was feeling soft towards a bunch of criminals that feared for their lives, and wanted Tony to make room for them at the special holding facilities at the Avengers compound. Tony had to admit that he really liked the heart on the kid, though it didn't make much sense to Tony as to why Peter even bothered to stop and listen to what criminals had to say.
That kid,
Tony had thought, with a shake of his head.
Always wanted to see the best in people.
Tony was no longer surprised by the fondness in the tone of his thoughts whenever he thought of Peter. At first, he had tried to push it away, not wanting to forge any sort of connection to the teenager. But somewhere down the line, Peter had worked his way into what little heart Tony actually had. And now Tony saw him as a son of sorts. Tony had never thought that he would have that sort of connection with anyone within his lifetime. But it had happened, and Tony was no longer going to fight it. He had chosen to embrace it, privately. Not even Peter knew that he'd grown soft. Which is why, over 2 hours later, when he had gotten a frantic call from the gorgeous May Parker asking where Peter was, Tony had found himself panicking. He had immediately cut off what General Ross had been about to say and ended the meeting promptly right then. Then he had wasted no time stepping into one of his Lamborghinis and sped through the streets of Manhattan, all the way to Queens. That's where Tony had found himself right then. Sprinting down the long hall, he hastily approached the apartment that belonged to the small family that he now loved and immediately banged on the door. It wasn't a moment later when May, beautiful May, had wrenched open the door. There were lines of worry that contorted her face. Her eyes were stained red, tears brimming through her lashes, and her cheeks splotchy. It was clear to anyone that merely glanced at her that she had been crying.
What happened?
Tony asked, his tone immediate and abrupt. And without waiting for any sort of formality of her inviting him in, he walked past her into the apartment. He made himself at home by taking off his sports jacket and setting it on the back of a bar stool before taking out his mini tablet. Immediately, he went about going through the motions of locating the tracker that he had installed in Peter's spider suit. May let out a shaky breath and ran a twitchy hand through her long brown hair as she followed him to the kitchen island.
I don't know. I mean, I talked to him 2 hours ago on the phone to rip into him about being late for curfew, and he said something about chasing a lead and about taking down the entire city's crime lords, and...
This certainly snapped Tony's rapt attention to her face.
Crime lords?
His fingers stopped pressing buttons on his tablet as he stared at her in surprise, before the seeping feeling of defensive anger started to settle within him.
Why didn't Peter call me? That is way too big for him to handle.
May nodded, biting her lip as the anxiety built within her evermore.
I know, that's what I said, and I asked him if he had called you, but he said that he had and that you were already on your way.
Tony immediately shook his head in negative. Peter had lied? Why would he? Oh. Well, it was to be expected, he supposed. There were times when Peter was so smart and mature for his age that Tony tended to forget that he was, in fact, a teenager. And when too many rules were implemented on a teenager, the next course of action tended to be that they rebelled. Tony himself had gone through this stage with his own parents, at an even larger scale than Peter would ever be able to fathom. But then again, this was a bigger line to cross than the partying, drugs, and hookers that Tony had chosen to partake in. No, Peter's chosen rebellion could result in getting himself severely injured, if not killed. Still, it was a rebellion nonetheless. How had Tony not foreseen this?
He never called me to say he was going after any crime lords. I'd only gotten an alert from Karen about 2 hours ago to say that Peter wanted me to do some criminal cleanup for him.
May turned abruptly away from him, nervously bringing her thumb up to her mouth and chewing on her fingernail as she began to pace.
Well, anyway, I had thought that it was taking a bit too long since I had heard from him, so I decided to call, only it didn't ring. I didn't even hear Karen's voice on the phone saying, "Connecting you to Peter Parker." The line was just dead. That's when I knew that something had been wrong, and then I called you and...
She trailed off as she started to cry once again. Tony immediately placed the tablet on the island countertop and stepped forward to gather her into his arms, trying his best to console her.
Hey, it'll be all right. Hey, I'm pinpointing his current location now. Wherever the tracker in his suit will say he will be, we will go right there and find him. Then you can ground him until he's married, I promise.
May nodded against his chest, allowing herself to be consoled for a mere moment, before she pulled back and pushed him softly away towards where he had set down his tablet on the kitchen counter. Tony took the hint and picked up his tablet again, once more going through the motions of activating the tracker in Peter's suit. It didn't take very long until a small ding came from the device, signaling that they had results. But as Tony stared down at the tablet, he looked at the screen in dubious disbelief.
That can't be right.
He muttered as he once again started pressing buttons on the device.
What is it?
May asked, worried for a whole new set of reasons now. Tony looked up at her, confusion in his eyes, which didn't happen often. He was a genius, after all.
It says that Peter's in the apartment right now. In fact...
Tony stood, his tablet still in his hand as he walked over to the couch that was sitting against the far wall.
It says that Peter is right in this very spot.
This is the coolest thing ever!
Spider-Man exclaimed from his upside-down position from the bedroom ceiling. Mary Jane couldn't help but laugh at his enthusiasm. It was actually rather contagious. She realized rather quickly that Spider-Man was a bit of a talker. Alright, maybe a huge talker. In fact, she would have a hard time getting the man to shut up. Not that she wanted to. Even without his memory, he said the most interesting things. She could find herself fascinated by him for hours at a time, if not days. Does all that blood rushing to your head make your head injury worse? Mary Jane couldn't help but ask. Her tone was teasing, but it was an actual concern. Spider-Man dropped from his attachment to the ceiling, landing perfectly on light amble feet. He shook his head.
No, actually, my head has been a lot better, and I think I had a nasty bruise on my side earlier, but that doesn't seem to hurt anymore either.
Mary Jane's eyebrows rose as she pondered this. Well, do you think that you have super healing? Spider-Man contemplated this as well before he shrugged.
Seems like the best explanation to me. Might be the reason why some of my memories are coming back so suddenly.
That was true. His brain must be healing itself at that very moment. There were certain times when key words that she said triggered a memory for him, and he would suddenly gasp out loud as it played through in his mind. He divulged earlier that it was almost like watching a movie of snippets of his life play in his brain. One of those instances had been when she had called him Spider again, and he had gasped and told her that he suddenly remembered the day that he had gotten his superpowers. And, much to her delight, he had told her about it.
I was watching an experiment at MidTech Industries. Dr. Connors, one of the top leading scientists there, had been doing a series of experiments with cross-species mutation. They had done all sorts of experiments on different animals, giving them traits from other species, and there was a spider. It must have been one of the experiments and had escaped from its enclosure, because the next thing I knew, it had bitten me, I'd gotten really sick, and I woke up with these powers.
It was absolutely mind-boggling to Mary Jane that she now knew the origins of his powers. But a part of her was worried that he would regret telling her about it, about any of the fragments of his life that he could suddenly remember. But she had asked him if he should really be telling her all of this personal stuff about himself, and he had shrugged, saying,
You had the chance to unmask me, but you didn't. I trust you.
His trust in her made her feel warm inside. Even now, it still managed to put a smile on Mary Jane's lips as she thought of it. Spider-Man chose the next moment to come sit next to her on the bed again. His close proximity caused goosebumps to burst up her arm and down her leg.
We've been talking so much about me, but I want to get to know more about you. I mean, you did save me back in that alleyway, so that actually makes you my hero.
Mary Jane grinned at him, and boldly reached out and threaded their fingers together once again, causing Spider-Man to choke over the unexpectedness of the action. What do you want to know? Spider-Man looked down at the interwoven fingers for a moment, thinking.
Well, you said earlier that this is your aunt's apartment, right?
Mary Jane nodded. Yes. Spider-Man tilted his head in contemplation, tilting his head upward once again so that he could look at her.
Then, where are your parents?
Mary Jane frowned at the question and looked away from him and down at her lap, which Spider-Man saw and immediately started apologizing.
I'm so sorry. That was stupid. I'm stupid. So stupid. You don't have to answer.
But Mary Jane shook her head and smiled slightly over at him. No, it's all right. You shouldn't have to be the only one revealing personal secrets tonight. Mary Jane took in a deep breath before continuing. My parents, they fight. A lot. As in screaming, throwing things at each other, fighting. So, whenever I can't stand the sound of their shouting, I come to my Aunt Anna's apartment. Spider-Man nodded solemnly as he listened to her words.
Doesn't sound easy.
His tone was compassionate, as though he wanted so badly to change her circumstances for her. Mary Jane shrugged, trying to appear as nonchalant before saying, Everyone has at least one thing in their life that makes things difficult. I figured that I could either mope about it or I can not let it bother me and try to be the best person I can be. Mary Jane turned to look at him with a small smile. Besides, I can't imagine that it's easy to suddenly wake up as a superhero with amnesia. Spider-Man held up a finger from his free hand in a scolding manner, shaking it in her direction.
Hey, I thought we were done talking about me here. Tell me more about you. What do you like to do?
Mary Jane couldn't help but grin at his upbeat tone and his change of subject to a lighter topic. Well, I want to be an actress and a model one day.
You would be perfect for that.
Spider-Man interrupted enthusiastically, his whole demeanor perking up with positivity. Mary Jane couldn't help but snicker slightly. And how would you know? This seemed to stop Spider-Man short, as he pulled in on himself with what could only be described as sheepishness. His free hand came up to the back of his masked head awkwardly.
Well, I mean, you are kinda hot.
Mary Jane stared at him for a moment, before she burst out laughing, letting go of his hand to hold her stomach as she fell backward on the mattress. Is Spider-Man really embarrassed? Alert the media. Spider-Man's secret weakness is teenage girls.
It is not?
Spider-Man exclaimed, his voice rising as he got defensive.
I mean, I don't know or remember any of my weaknesses, but teenage girls can't be one of them.
Mary Jane laughed even more, glad to be getting such a big reaction out of him. He groaned in the face of her laughter as his head fell forward into his open palms. Face it, Spider. Teenage girls are your kryptonite. But you have to admit, it's a whole lot better of a weakness than a big hunk of space rock. Spider-Man hesitantly lifted his head as he tilted it in her direction.
Really?
Mary Jane nodded as she calmed down, taking a moment to breathe before she sat up and bumped her shoulder against his. Yep. Very James Bond of you to have a weakness for the ladies. She could both sense and hear the smile on his lips.
Call me man. Spider-Man.
Hey, you remembered a pop culture reference. Mary Jane beamed at him. Spider-Man chuckled a bit before replying.
Actually, too, I knew what your kryptonite reference was. In fact, I think that I remember having a Superman bedspread when I was a kid. Yeah, I remember it now, but that quickly changed to Iron Man sheets when...
He broke off with a gasp, a sign that Mary Jane had quickly learned was an indicator that he had triggered another memory. She patiently waited for him to explain his memory, if he chose to share it with her at all. She wasn't disappointed.
When I was a kid, I was at the Stark Expo that night when the drones were attacking. It had been chaos. People were running around, and I'd gotten separated by, well, whoever it was that had taken me.
Mary Jane nodded as she listened, silently letting him know that she was following along.
I was wearing one of those toy Iron Man masks and gloves, and one of those drones had landed in front of me. I thought I could be a hero, blast the drone with my fake gloves, just like Iron Man. Then the drone had aimed its missiles right at me when it was suddenly blasted to pieces.
She looked at him incredulously, wondering if he was just remembering an Iron Man fantasy that he had as a boy rather than actual reality.
At first, I thought I was the one who had blasted the drone, but then I turned around and there was Iron Man standing right behind me. He was the one who had really blasted the drone. But then, right before he flew off again to fight more drones, he had looked at me and said, "Nice work, kid."
Mary Jane stared at him before she brought her legs up and hugged her knees to her chest. Sounds traumatizing. Spider-Man immediately shook his head.
No, if anything, it made me idolize Tony even more.
The two of you are close then? It was news to Mary Jane. It certainly wasn't public knowledge that Iron Man and Spider-Man had any sort of bond at all. Sure, they had teamed up a couple of times, but that didn't necessarily mean anything. Just because two heroes happened to fight together didn't mean that they treated each other to lunch or had late-night heart-to-heart conversations.
Yeah,
Spider-Man said slowly, still slightly uncertain.
I think we are.
They were quiet for a brief moment before Spider-Man let out a long sigh. What is it? She asked, worried. Spider-Man shook his head and waved off her concern.
It's nothing, it's just that how can I remember all that, but not even remember my own name?
The fear had crept back into his voice, revealing his insecurity over his current predicament. Mary Jane may not have super strength. She may not be tech-savvy or can hack into highly classified databases. And she may have never been in a life-threatening situation before in her life. But this, his anxiety, Mary Jane could handle. Relaxing, Mary Jane presented him with a gentle smile as she released the hold she had on her knees. Hey, it will all come back to you. Maybe not in this very moment, but it will soon. Spider-Man merely nodded, not seeming very reassured by her words no matter how true they actually were. Mary Jane suddenly looked away from him and bit her lip, tucking strands of red hair behind her ear nervously. And when that does happen, when you remember everything? She trailed off, unsure if she should continue with what she wanted to say.
Yes?
He asked. Mary Jane swallowed, finally looking at him. Will you promise me something? Spider-Man nodded, hesitantly, and she continued. When you get your memory back, will you promise that you won't forget me? Eye contact broken. Mary Jane could only look down again as she had said it. There. She had put it out there. It may not have been with the Mary Jane level of confidence that she was used to, but she had still been brave enough to say it. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Spider-Man relax.
Mary Jane?
His voice was so soft as he reached out and took her hand in his once again, grasping it tight. Butterflies burst about like mad in the pit of her stomach.
How could I ever forget you?
Mary Jane let out the breath that she had been holding as she beamed at him, taking that very moment to suddenly launch herself at him in a fierce hug, surprising them both at the action. It had been subconscious on her part, but she couldn't say that she regretted the results. Spider-Man had been frozen initially at the embrace, his entire body tense, before he relaxed and wound his arms around her torso, pulling her closer. She marveled at how strong his arms felt around her, how deliciously hard his pecs and washboard abs felt pressed against her. She was most definitely infatuated. Mary Jane turned her head so that her chin rested on his shoulder, breathing in his manly musk, but was also surprised to notice that he actually smelled quite clean. There was definitely a distinct scent of sandalwood, and it was immediately intoxicating to her senses. Spider-Man drew circles on her side where his hand rested and let out a satisfied sigh.
Besides,
Spider-Man said suddenly, his mouth right at her ear. The little hairs that she had there stood on end.
it's impossible for a person to forget their heroes.